Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes, and I am here to help you understand what's going on in the news. Привет, mój друзі. I hope I pronounced that right. Hello, my friends. Okay, so here's what's going on in the news today. I'll talk about the ISW assessment. We'll talk about time frames. We'll talk about weapons deliveries and the phases of the war. And the ISW does a masterful job today of just laying everything out visually as well as in print. We'll talk about how Putin threatened Boris Johnson and some insight into the cause of the war. Different people have different opinions about why the war started. Was it minerals? Was it NATO? Was it this? Was it that? This gives some insight. We'll talk about why tanks are about more than just tanks. Like we get fixated on, well, how many or what kind, or no, there's a bigger picture behind it, and we're trying to look behind the headlines to understand what's going on. We'll also read an interesting article with a Harvard professor who is the head of the negotiation department at Harvard, and we'll talk about why you shouldn't bargain with the devil. We'll get into that in just a little bit, and then we'll have some fun with Russian state media. So here we go. Before we do any of that, and this was not on the list, but we're going to look at the Ministry of Defense from Great Britain. They talked about Russian authorities are likely keeping open the option of another round of call-ups under partial mobilization. They held up some folks that had dual passports from Kyrgyzstan and Russia, and they held them at the border. And they also said the Russian leadership is highly likely continues to search for ways to meet the high number of personnel required to resource any future major offensive in Ukraine. Okay, that wasn't part of what we're talking about, but mobilization's coming. It's just a matter of time. You can almost feel it. Let's go to the ISW and talk about what was said there. We talked about delays in the provision of Ukraine's Western long-range fire systems, advanced air defense systems, and tanks have limited Ukraine's ability to take advantage of opportunities for larger counteroffensive operations. So, because it's taken so long to get tanks and to get the right kind of missiles and to get the right kind of equipment and things along those lines, it's like Ukraine doesn't have the same opportunity to press a winter offensive when the ground hardened over. So, they've kind of lost an opportunity, and they lost an opportunity at a time where Russia really didn't have it all together. Had they had these weapons, they probably could have pressed a lot harder and made more inroads. Ukraine, however, does not have a significant domestic military industry to turn to in the absence of Western support. They're completely reliant on Western partners. The military aid provided by U.S.-led Western coalition has been essential to Ukraine's survival, and that's why they need to hold the coalition together, because as long as they have their partners, they can defeat Russia potentially. Without them, there's really very little prospect of that. The will is there. That's not a question, but it is a question of whether they'll have the supplies to be able to do it. The war has unfolded in 3 major periods, and the ISW did a really great job with this chart. If you look at this chart, you see requirements for Western material support to Ukraine, and then you see 3 phases: the Russian initiative, the Ukrainian initiative, and then positional warfare, like what's going to be happening down the line, right? So the first thing was just, here's the beginning of the war in February. They're after Kyiv. The Russians are after Mariupol. They're attempting to encircle in the east the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in May and June, right? And it was all Russia all the time. Then they started to get things like they asked for HIMARS. That's asked for their HIMARS and weapons requested, and when it arrived. And they got HIMARS, and guess what? A lot of things changed. Okay. Then you started seeing the Ukrainians pushing back and setting the conditions, the Kharkiv and Kherson offensive, the defense of Bakhmut, which has gone out. Like the Russians have attacked Bakhmut for 6 months, and they haven't been able to take it. So they have, again, NASAMS, here they requested, and here they are getting it. And then tanks have been requested. Here tanks are going to start arriving they're starting to arrive, so that's going to change what's going on the battlefield. But you got to understand, there's a time frame between what's going on, what's being asked for, and what you're actually going to get. The continual delays in providing Western material when it became apparent that it is or will soon be needed have thus contributed to the protraction of the conflict. So the war is taking longer because it's taking time to get the material out there, and that's unfortunate. People are literally dying in the process. Recent Western commitments to provide Ukraine with tanks and armored vehicles it requires for further counteroffensive operations are important, but the delays in making those commitments may have cost Ukraine a window of opportunity, and that's what I was talking about earlier on. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about this fascinating article. There's a documentary coming out, and Boris Johnson was saying that Putin actually threatened to essentially nuke, or could nuke, the UK if things didn't, if he didn't get out of the way. So Boris, I don't want to hurt you, but with a missile, it would only take a minute, says Putin to former Prime Minister Johnson before the war kicked off. Former Prime Minister said the Russian leader had bragged it would only take a minute to kill him with a missile after he warned him to abandon his plans to attack Ukraine. He was trying to talk Putin out of it. The astonishing threat was made in February of last year after Mr. Johnson visited Kyiv to assure Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky that Britain would back his country if Russia invaded, and that was the right thing to do. The US, the UK, and Russia were guarantors of the Minsk Budapest Memorandum, which when Ukraine gave up their nukes, the US and UK and Russia said, we'll guarantee your sovereign borders from that point forward. Okay, Mr. Johnson told him that war would be an utter catastrophe and trigger unprecedented Western sanctions. Well, he didn't lie. That is exactly what happened. Now, let's switch gears. We'll come back to that when we have fun with some Russian state media, but let's switch gears and talk about tanks, why tanks are important, and what it means. First, I saw this, and this made me think of the tanks, right? Germany confirms it will not send fighter jets to Ukraine. Well, it also confirmed that it's not sending tanks. And, right, so the red line has changed and moved and been passed, and there's a new red line, and I think it will only be a matter of time before Germany is involved in sending either tanks or rockets, planes or rockets, something, but they'll be part of the package. Yesterday, I talked about how there are 321 tanks in Ukraine, or being sent to Ukraine. And I told you I saw it on TV, but so I didn't have the article. Here, just a quick Google search of this, 321 tanks to Ukraine. Yeah, Reuters is confirming it, CNN, France 24. So yeah, it's there. So that makes a big difference. It's not just here's a dozen or a couple dozen tanks. It's a big difference. Now, 321 in an area of the landmass of Portugal, yeah, I get, but if you can concentrate them in the right places at the right time, that can make a significant difference. But tanks are more than just about tanks. Tanks are about the message being sent, and that's what you need to understand. The decision last week by Germany not only to allow other countries to send German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine is significant, not only for the Ukrainian war effort, but also for the credibility of organizations such as the EU and NATO. That's right. If you say, we're going to stand by you, and then you don't, you lose credibility. And then bad people do what bad people do. They take more advantage of it. So the promises of tanks send a clear message of unity to Ukraine and to the world. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again, and this is a fascinating article with a Harvard professor. Dr. Robert Mnookin is a professor of law at Harvard Law School, the director of the Harvard Negotiation Research Project, former chair of the program on negotiation at Harvard. He's the author of 9 books, including Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. Okay, so he's going to give us some good insight into what we should be doing or not doing with Putin. So he started off by talking about Mandela and Churchill and saying, like, look, they're in different positions. Winston Churchill, for example, in the spring of 1940, at Britain's darkest hour when the fall of France was imminent. Remember, when Churchill came to power, France was just about to fall. He gave the blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech, like as his first speech in Parliament just before France fell. Right? And Britain was standing alone. It refused to pursue an opportunity to have Mussolini mediate between Nazi Germany and Great Britain. And that was on the table. If you want to watch a good dramatization of this, watch The Darkest Hour, and you'll get a good sense of what this was like, how terrible the crisis was. Churchill refused to negotiate even though he knew the Battle of Britain was about to begin, and even though the outcome of that battle was far from certain. Like, we look back in hindsight and think like, yeah, that was the right thing, but the outcome wasn't predetermined. So Churchill is my hero because he refused to negotiate. Sometimes there are times that you should refuse to negotiate. Talked about Mandela as well. Here he talks about some more about Great Britain. It talks about if the West pushes Ukraine into negotiations and into making territorial concessions, it's very much like Munich, what before World War II really kicked off. Great Britain and France, even without the participation of the Czech government, made a deal with Hitler that gave them part of what had been Czechoslovakia. And Hitler said, I remember reading this because I did my master's thesis on Hitler and the Third Reich. Hitler said that if he had been stopped in the Sudetenland, he would have stopped. But you can't encourage a bully or they keep going on. That was a disgraceful negotiation, and I think that there's certainly a risk here that the Ukrainians, after all, are fighting for the liberty of their country and for the West to impose a resolution. I think that would be wrong. Yeah, you don't want to go down that kind of path. Now he goes on, before the United States entered the last World War, Churchill had to determine whether to negotiate with the Nazis. He had to think about the range of deals that might be possible and the probability that they would be acceptable to both Great Britain and to Hitler. He viewed the odds as very low, and he also observed correctly that Hitler was not trustworthy. This sounds kind of familiar, right? He might agree to a ceasefire now, but what would stop him from aggression later? This is exactly where Zelensky finds himself, in the same position as Churchill, dealing with a Hitler or a Putin. Churchill also had to think about the cost of entering negotiations. Could the discussions be kept secret? And what would happen if they weren't kept secret? And if Churchill was right that an acceptable deal would not be possible? What would be the impact of a ceasefire followed by a resumption of warfare on the spirits of the British people? That's a great question. Churchill had to consider the costs and the consequences of failed negotiations on the ability of his nation to later resist Hitler. Entering into negotiations is not costless. So doing that now, pressing Zelensky into doing that now, it's still, there's a cost to it, and you have to be aware of it. Like, what's going to happen to the average Ukrainian who's seeing Zelensky sit down at the negotiating table? Seeing him refuse to negotiate, it stiffens their spine. It causes them to say, yeah, that's right, we're not going to stop. We're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep going. Okay? Can Putin be trusted? Well, the simple answer is no, but let's get down to it. I think you're confusing two things, he says. First of all, does Putin have a strong interest in ensuring that Ukraine is never part of NATO? The answer is yes. Does the West know that? Yes. Did Putin make that clear? Yes. That's different from whether you can trust him. So just because you understand his position doesn't mean you can actually trust him. Not everything Putin says is a lie. And when he says it's not my interest for Ukraine to join NATO, that is, from his perspective, the truth. But on the other hand, the Russians entered into agreements in respect to the sovereignty of Ukraine. Russia violated in 2014 and 2022, saw another violation. Can he be trusted to keep his word when he makes an agreement all the time? Not at all. Does he sometimes keep his word? Yes. So you have to understand, like, what are you actually dealing with on the other side of the table? And so that's what he's getting into. He says, I have students who say, well, I'm just never going to negotiate with someone I don't trust. And I say, well, in the real world, as I know it, that's going to be extremely limiting and won't serve your interests. So what do you do with someone you don't trust? Well, you figure out what you can actually hang your hat on. And he said this, I think President Biden is extremely sensitive to the possibility of a wider war. He, on the other hand, wants to deter future Russian aggression and support Ukraine, but in a way that at least minimizes the direct confrontation between the Russians and the United States. And so far, I think he's been doing that very well. For example, there's an argument that we should be providing air support because there are so many Ukrainians suffering. On the other hand, I think Biden wisely sees that if, in fact, American pilots are involved, there's a real risk of direct confrontation that could be escalatory, right? So Biden has been somewhat deterred by Putin, but over time, he's gradually giving more and more and more and more, and he's been trying to thread this needle because it's a tough thing. You didn't want to kick off World War III, and you didn't want to not support Ukraine. Now, of course, Putin is making a threat that he might use a tactical nuclear weapon. My own belief is that it's extremely unlikely. Hey, I said the same thing. Go back a couple of days and we'll see nukes don't matter in Ukraine. I said this just a couple of days. I don't think that it is actually possible for Putin to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He can't. There's nothing good comes of it. And I don't think, will do it. Mnuchin says the same kind of thing. My own belief is that it's extremely unlikely. I think he wanted to raise the specter because he thought he might have deterrent effect on the West support. Well, what if Putin were losing? Then what? Well, my point is that you're making an assumption that using a tactical nuclear weapons would have substantial military benefits for Russia. I'm not a military expert, but those who are suggest that there is no significant advantage in this war to using tactical nuclear weapons, given the way that the war is being fought. On the other hand, using them risks a huge cost for Russia, including condemnation by the Chinese, the Turks, the Indians, and others who have been somewhat supportive. So he would lose that base. And he says, I can't see why using a nuclear weapon would serve Putin's interest. Same argument I made. Okay, so I hope that gives you some background or insight into the way that he's thinking about this kind of thing. And so this article was really, really profound. I can link it below so that if you want to read the whole, you're welcome to it. Now let's turn our attention to some fun with Russian state media. Here's the first article. Russian troops are offered rewards for destroying NATO tanks. Remember, there's going to be a lot of them out there, particularly for U.S. American-made tanks. Forez, a Russian chemical manufacturer, is offering bounties to soldiers for destroying Western-made battle tanks. Well, that's charming. Forez will pay 5 million rubles, or $70,700, for the first trophy, and the payment for every next one will be 500,000 rubles, or $7,000. It's nothing to sneeze at. The company added that if Ukraine ever acquires F-15 and F-16 jet fighters, Forez would hand out 15 million ruble prize for the first down aircraft. Again, it's another way, I think, of kind of deterring the West from sending your equipment to the battlefield. This article I thought was pretty interesting. Russia denounces drone raid on Iran. There was a drone raid on Iranian military or industrial base. I'm not exactly sure what it was, and we don't know exactly who it was. But then, let me just read. This is Maria Zakharova saying, "We strongly condemn any provocative action that could lead to an uncontrolled escalation of tensions in an already volatile region," said Zakharova, which is just absolutely amazing that she could say that. But we actually don't know who did it yet. I'm sure it'll come out in the press shortly. Another article, Kremlin, Putin did not threaten to kill Johnson in the missile strike. How dare he say that? What Mr. Johnson said is not true. More precisely, a lie, says Peskov, who lies. Peskov knows lies. So, yeah, whether he did or didn't, it's kind of a moot point because they did say this in state media. This was May 3rd, Russian TV shows. This is the Washington Post. Okay, Russian TV show shows a simulation of Britain and Ireland wiped out by a nuke. So whether Putin said it just before this or whether he said it after is kind of immaterial. I want you to show you this. This is it's Sunday night in Russian TV, and this is a guy saying this. It actually seems to me that they're raving on the British Isles. And I'm going to play a little bit more, and you'll see the simulation here that they're going to show. They're going to show a simulation of Russia nuking. The island is so small. It's sufficient to sink once and for all already. Everything's been calculated already. You see that what was going on here? They were actually saying, why threaten a never-ending Russia with nuclear weapons? And then they're going to show Russian missiles firing from Russia into Great Britain. And the island's so small, just one Samrat missile. Here we go. There you go. Look at that. It's sufficient to sink it once and for all. So I remember this back in May, and there was plenty of saber rattling before that, but wow. Okay. So they lie about lying. America is a terrorist country, protesters chant to the U.S. ambassador to Russia. The new U.S. ambassador, they chanted, America's a terrorist country. War is USA business, and what did you come for? Now, my only question is whether Larissa was in here somewhere doing the chanting. You know, Larissa or Where's Waldo, who keeps showing up in all the photos with Putin. Or if so, is it staged, or do the people actually feel that? Because the people generally don't come out to protest. So that's my only concern. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you for your time. Thank you. If you like this, please give me a like, subscribe, share. I'd appreciate it. And there's a lot of back videos. If you've missed something over time, I've really tried to cover all the news, and you can go back all the way to day 85. I'll see you tomorrow, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.